So let's get
And
started.
Billy, I think Lauren is still on maternity leave, so that's probably why she's not here.
Yeah, I think she is. So thank you. All right. Well,
what did she have? A boy or girl?
A girl. Her name is Callan. I hope it's okay I said that.
That's beautiful.
Great. Well, thanks for that good news, and thanks everyone for joining us to the September 1st, 2022 meeting of the Vermont Climate Council Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee meeting. We have not met since March, I believe. So it's good to see everyone again. We've got a pretty full agenda today that is up on the website. Let's see, and our first action is to approve that draft agenda, and I can just kind of run through it quickly. We're going to talk about the draft agricultural emissions RFP, ideally try to approve that at the subcommittee level. We'll discuss the upcoming budgeting process that the Climate Council is going to go through, and how our priorities might feed up into that. We're hopefully going to be joined by Sonia Riley, our new youth member, at some point today. I think this is her second day of school, so she's doesn't have a lot of flexibility, but is going to try to dip out and say hi to us on Zoom. We're going to get an update from the Biomass Task Group members of the subcommittee, and then have some time for any other topics folks want to raise, hear from the public, and adjourn by noon. So any additions or revisions to that agenda? Okay, silence and nods. We'll consider that approved. We also posted the minutes from that March meeting. I don't think anyone took minutes at the time, so I went through earlier in the week and watched the video and came up with some basic minutes. So if folks have had a chance to review those, can we approve them? Okay, looking for some nods. So I think we're good with the minutes. So now we can move on to our first topic. So Jane, do you want to kick us off on this, or would you prefer Alyssa or Ryan or folks on that task group lead off?
I'd like to defer to Alyssa and Ryan and others on, and Colin and Megan are joining us too from Science and Data. So I can happily defer to the substantive expertise around the RFP to provide the context, but I'll just remind folks that as a recommendation from your components of the Climate Action Plan, there was interest to pursue further analysis of the tools that we use to analyze the agricultural sector within the greenhouse gas inventory. The Agency of Natural Resources, with support from the Agricultural Department, Ryan and Judson, put together a grant to the U.S. Climate Alliance to support this work. We were successful in receiving $70,000. And we've been working collaboratively with the task group that consists of Abby, Ryan, Colin, Megan, Alyssa, and Judson to put together an RFP that we would hopefully post after final approval by the subcommittee today, and then hopefully advance having someone under contract later this fall, mid-fall, to move forward with this work. So we wanted to ensure that, as has been customary with all of our RFPs and contracts, that prior to posting, that we had a public meeting to discuss the final components of it, where we landed, and have any comments from the public that as we're interested. So that's where we're at. We had a meeting of the task group, incorporated comments collectively that were received from Alyssa, Ryan, Judson, and are ready to move forward with that. So why don't I turn it over if there's anything substantive about the RFP that Alyssa, Ryan, or anybody would like to touch on, and then we can have a discussion about next steps.
Great.
Great, thanks Jane for all your work on this. Ryan, did you want to go? Sorry, I saw you unmute right after I started talking. I don't think I have a lot to add. I think for folks that haven't been following this, maybe I could read like the key elements that of the work that we're requesting, just for review, if you haven't heard, were from the contract draft that we sent around. The analysis is composed of these things: a review of the existing tools and necessary data sets to accurately quantify greenhouse gas emissions from the ag sector in Vermont, and how well those tools align with both the EPA SIT approach that's already used for the inventory, and then how those tools align with the IPCC standards for the ag and land use sector. And then some recommendations of tools or sets of tools that would be appropriate for Vermont to update and change potentially how it accounts for ag emissions in the greenhouse gas inventory, or to use as kind of a complementary analysis and assessment to inform mitigation decision making. And so really we're just looking for great information to advise how we do greenhouse gas accounting for the ag and ecosystem sector. And I think moving this forward as soon as possible is kind of my goal. I think the sooner we get people hired and engaged to do the work, the better.
Great, thanks for that. Anyone else from the task group want to share thoughts or observations or things that we should hear or know about?
I'll share briefly kind of other concurrent initiatives that are happening, I suppose. Very appreciative of U.S. Climate Alliance for their funding, about $25,000 for this research work. But I'm not sure if folks were aware in the Inflation Reduction Act, and I'll post the language into the chat, but under the conservation title for conservation technical assistance for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, they were appropriated this fiscal year and to be used by 2031. $300 million to carry out a program to quantify carbon sequestration and carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions through both field data as well as a way to track and monitor those trends through the greenhouse gas inventory and assessment program at the Department of Agriculture. And so, $75,000, I think it's going to really help Vermont move forward in how to understand this, but on the national level, the amount of funding that's going to be put at this question, I think is going to, help answer a lot of these questions we're grappling with in Vermont on the national scale. And so I'll just put that language in there, but I'm very excited to see that component as part of the Inflation Reduction Act.
Thanks, Ryan. And Megan, I think you wanted to get in there as well.
Yeah, just another kind of complementary effort that's going on related to the forest sector or forestry in this sector. Ali Kasiba she has recently transitioned to UVM Extension, but in her role working with forests and parks, had worked on a multi-state effort that's also being funded by the Climate Alliance to engage in a similar exercise for forest-related carbon. And I just wanted to mention, just so folks are aware that, this, and we worked with Ali when we were crafting this, the request for the grant funding and then the draft RFP, because we wanted to make sure that these efforts are not redundant of the work that she and multi-state partners are doing in the forest space. So I just wanted to provide that for additional context in case any members were kind of wondering why this is particularly focused on agricultural emissions. There is a kind of a parallel effort that's being supported by other states in New England as well, including Vermont. So I thought that might be helpful to know.
Thanks, Megan. And that actually, if folks don't mind, leads to a question I had about the RFP, that it does seem to pull in the forestry and other land use sectors. And it's not entirely clear if that's just for contextual purposes or whether this is going to be doing like a forest land, a comparable analysis of how we track emissions from the forest and natural land sectors as well.
I think it's a nomenclature thing, attempting to be congruent with the IPCC framing for national inventories, which puts both ag emissions and the LULUCF together. And so whereas I see this kind of RFP as looking just narrowly at the agricultural question, there is obviously, as part of the research question, other areas associated with agriculture that are used in part of farming that aren't included in the inventory. And so, being broad in that language is, also part of the question, right? Like, what's the right lens through which to look at this? So this does not purport to do anything in any of the other sectors that are in the ag emissions inventory, in my view, at this time, or really focusing on other natural working lands. It's really just about ag land, and that land is managed by farmers in Vermont for farming, in my view. So just trying to get the language consistent, I think, is why that term was used.
Great, thank you.
I'll chime in for a second there and just kind of follow up on what Ryan was saying, and that I think ideally this RFP is more focused on ag, but it would be, we're hoping to be able to kind of combine it with the analysis that Megan mentioned to kind of make a more complete AFO of the sector in its entirety. So I think this RFP is more focused on that specific component of the sector, but I think that's why it was mentioned in the RFP.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Jane, you got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I was going to really echo what Colin just said about the complementary analysis, and just comment a little bit further, just for everybody's reference, that about Allie. So folks might know that Allie Casibo is the climate change forester. She had been supporting this task group, and she has gone on to last Friday. The state government is now working for UVM Extension, doing much of what she was able to do for Forest Parks and Recreation, because she's working through the community and outreach department there on that level of work. But so I just want to mention, if folks have any questions about that grant, Colin and I are now managing it for the interim, but we have hopes that we'll be able to hire a natural and working land sector program manager for the Climate Action Office this fall to replace Allie's position specifically on policy work around natural and working lands. And we'll be coordinating closely with Marley, with the Ag Department, and others to really think about thoughtfully what that person will do.
Thanks. Any other, Jake?
Yeah, two just quick reactions when I was looking at it yesterday was just how is the time frame affected by the fact that I think the expectation sort of in the draft was that this would be out in August. So I don't know if that like shifts meaningfully any of the dates, or if any of the dates can actually meaningfully be shifted based on what the delivery dates need to be to the legislature. And so that was one thing, or to the Climate Council. And then the other is, I know we've probably talked about this and drawn out this distinction. I'm just wondering if it's worth drawing it out here, is where specifically the misalignment between the EPA SIT and the IPCC standards are. Like what is the crux of that difference that we're trying to, we want people responding to this to really identify and speak to their knowledge and expertise to do that, because that seems to be an underlying piece of this work, is that there's a distinction between those two, and we're trying to close that gap and create a methodology that brings them closer in alignment. So I just, I don't know, people are responding to this, they might have that context and sort of know that inherently as part of the work that they do, but just wondering if that needs to be made more explicit than how it's currently phrased in the RFP.
Good question. Any thoughts on that from the task group?
Thanks, Jake. I don't know how deep to get into that, but I think certainly that it's part of the intent. I think it's it kind of depends on how you look at the SIT. This gets a little bit more into kind of the land use sector and the inventory as a whole. But so right now, like the SIT tool for the ag sector, it doesn't include, I think part of this is management, and Brian, feel free to jump in, correct me on any of this, but part of the real concern is that it doesn't include kind of management practices. It's more based on fertilizer use and total animal counts and emission factors associated with those. I think that's pretty well established. There is a separate sector for the SIT that is actual land use kind of net calculation. We haven't really used that in the past except for forestry because we haven't really had the data to support that. When I put that together this time, I'm hoping to make that more robust, and hopefully I'm going to incorporate some of the work done on the carbon budget into that. And the timing for this effort may not work for the next iteration of the inventory, but going forward, we're hoping to kind of make it a more robust thing. I guess in terms of this analysis, I think it's fine to have it in there more explicitly to kind of find that, and I don't know if disconnect really is the right word. It's just kind of two separate pieces, and the SIT is, I think, not as granular as a lot of these tools are. It doesn't capture the same level of detail because that's not entirely what it was designed to do. So I don't have a problem calling that out a little more specifically, but I think that is generally going to be understood by people responding to this. But happy to hear others' thoughts on that too.
I appreciate that, Colin, and just to follow up a bit on the question. In the SIT tool does what it does, right? It looks at essentially non-CO2 emissions from the ag sector on a gross basis, and then it has a ag soil carbon flux based on land use change, the parameters of which function fine, but for which, in the context of the Global Warming Solutions Act, creates challenges when it's a gross emission reduction basis for a net sector based on how the IPCC looks at the accounting for a national framework. And so trying to find the right approach to acknowledging the sector as having multiple components and the best and most accurate way to catalog that is, I think, where this RFP can definitely help try to understand that synthesis, because if you do SIT for the non-CO2 generally, there's some CO2 loss in urea use, but that's a fossil fuel-based product, so it makes sense why that's counted. Everything else is really methane and nitrous oxide in the ag emission side. When you look at the land use change from forestry, ag soil carbon flux, which is a newly updated module, which does exist for Vermont, it provides contact and kind of like the gross acres in hay, gross acres in corn, pasture, the flux between forested, non-forested, et cetera. But what's in the middle there, and I think what this RFP is trying to get at, is how farmers manage that land can influence the rate of sequestration or net loss or net emission, right? And so what we saw from the carbon budget, as Colin pointed out, is that depending on management, you can be net emitter, you can be net sequestration, and what are the data sources and points that are needed to kind of synthesize and build the bridge between that. So, SIT acknowledged that there was this IPCC change in AFOLU language, and I think that's why I'm so insistent on trying to see that through the Climate Alliance or work the state does to acknowledge that, AFOLU is both the emissions and the soil carbon flux, and potentially also practices if you get to tier 3. And so this RFP isn't going to answer it's going to point directions at like how to build bridges between that. But in my mind, it's something that's going to take a bit more time to fix, and that's why I keep and appreciate Jane bringing that up on a BPR interview, right? Like national work to look at ag sector and figure out the most accurate and best way to kind of look at this sector on a net basis is likely what's going to be needed. So sorry to ramble on there, but it's but it's at the core, I think, of what the tension has been in looking at emission reduction requirements for the only sector that's biogenic based that it has a gross threshold, right? Like there are gross emissions from forestry, from harvested wood products. There are gross emissions from wetlands, but they're all in the land use change and forestry sector. And it's I don't know. Yeah, there's still work to be done. But yeah, so I think the way this RFP is framed is it's definitely going to try to give us a bit of a roadmap at how to look at this, in a holistic context, hopefully. So sorry for that really long diatribe, but it's a great question.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Well, this is really encouraging to see this getting to this point where the RFP will hopefully be finalized and launched, and this important work gets underway. Any other comments, thoughts, questions from the subcommittee for the task group members or vice versa?
Is just anything on the timing? So, because I just noticed that the draft dates for, I think maybe releasing the RFP were August, and now unfortunately we're in September, which is hard to believe.
I bet that's easy to update, and yeah, makes sense. Like as soon as it goes through QA, there'll be some changes to the dates based on when it's released. But that's definitely a good call.
Okay, Judy, go ahead, please.
I would just like to say that Ag and Ecosystem Committee members need to know that their recommendations have been tabled and a new agenda was established and presented and adopted.
Could you, in what context? In the context of this RFP or today?
No, in the context you asked if there was anything the task committee would like them to know. And I would like them to know that all of the recommendations that form the task committee were tabled.
For the ag emissions group?
Mhm.
Okay.
All the ag and ecosystems recommendation for the biomass task group has been tabled.
Right.
And I would like people to know that.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Judy. And we're going to have some more time later this morning to talk about the biomass task group in depth. So that's a really important.
I know that. I saw that on the agenda, but you just simply asked, is there anything you want them to know? And yeah, I want them to know because they're moving forward. And so is the biotask committee without knowing that the original recommendations have not been considered.
Any other comments, thoughts? Marley?
Yeah, I guess I just want to clarify, if possible, the length of time of this contract. It reads to me that's maybe 3 months between kickoff and final presentation or report. That seems incredibly ambitious.
I imagine we'll learn more through the RFP process, but in all, when we did the carbon budget and the original analysis of our inventory that compared it to other states, it was roughly 3 months, maybe less, that component of our larger Cadmus contract. So it feels relatively possible, but if the cost is challenging, we can certainly extend the timeline.
Yeah, no, so Marley, I think it's a great comment, and I really appreciate you bringing that up. And I think that the contractors providing feedback is good because even though they did it in 3 months, there were numerous error and omissions as we wrote into our, the review of the carbon budget, just from a analytical standpoint, but also, not having the time to fully dig into some components of the tool or the Vermont data. So I do agree that making sure that the contractor has sufficient time, and that may in part be driven by the deadline for having, I'm not sure, but this is grant funded, right? And so there's a deadline for delivering a final report back to the Climate Alliance. And so that may inform some of those deadlines, but yeah, I would definitely agree. Marley seems very ambitious, and I apologize for not catching that sooner. But yeah, if the contractor says, we need more time, I definitely think that is needed, because that was one of the biggest challenges, is how rushed everything was through the whole climate action, initial climate action plan development. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, maybe I missed it in the RFP. Maybe it does say this, but I just fear that a contractor might say, no way I can do it in 3 months and not even apply and discuss it. So if just putting some language in there that indicates this is negotiable, or at least up for some discussion.
Definitely agree with that, for sure, from my view.
Okay, anything else on this topic for today? So should we, do we need to formally act to kind of endorse this draft RFP with the kind of recommended tweaks that were discussed this morning, or is this conversation adequate for us to kind of move on? Task group members, do you have a thought or preference there? We're good.
I mean, I think if the subcommittee by consensus supports moving forward, and if there are clear, the only actual, besides recommendations sounded like they were just ensure that there is ample time for the work to be delivered, so we can both extend the date and make it clear that when consultants put together their proposals, they should give us a timeline that they can complete reasonable around the funding that we have. So happy to fix that. And there was one more comment that Jake made that I saw Alyssa had responded to in the comments around perhaps actually ensuring that we put a little bit more clarity around the differences between, and we can add a sentence on that within the RFP. So assuming those two things are corrected and hearing no opposing views, will advance the RFP in a timely fashion.
Everyone comfortable with that? Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for your work and presenting this information to us, and look forward to that piece moving forward.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, it's Abby. I just wanted to say thank you so much for all the work that's been done on this. I'm really excited to see what information we can get out of it.
Great. So now we are going to move on to our second substantive topic, which is the upcoming budget process at the Climate Council, and how this subcommittee can help prioritize and inform that process. And I know a bit about this, so if it's appropriate for me to try to explain it, Jan, I'm happy to, but if you are good with providing that context, that would be fine too.
I'm happy to provide the context, but then also really, defer. This is really a subcommittee process that you can choose to engage in or not, but happy to provide the backstory and the clarity at this point, as we see it from the work that's been done by the steering committee over the summer. You likely won't remember since it's been a while, but I'll just say that the council has taken largely the summer off in anticipation of 4 meetings this fall and a more robust work schedule this fall. That schedule has really been focused around lifting up the recommendations from the Biomass Task Group and the Transportation Task Group, which have two of the sort of substantive components of work that have been carrying forward as in effort to put forward addendums to the initial climate action plan. So the timelines that those 2 task groups have been working on were in anticipation of this fall. Also, the steering committee continued to meet this fall in order to give some process and guidance to further prioritization for the council this fall to go into the legislative session to lift up priorities. As part of that process and procedural conversation at the steering committee, there was an interest to carry forward and inform a budget process that would help advance initiatives being considered by the council and its subcommittees. You'll recall that last year, with the approval of the climate action plan not coming till December, it was sort of too late to thoughtfully lift up recommendations in a collaborative way at the council. And so this year, the steering committee wanted to ensure that we had time this fall to do that. I think sort of at the 11th hour, perhaps I would have hoped we could have circled out to the subcommittee sooner, but when the governor's guidance came out for budgeting from state agencies, it was not released till August, and it became clear that state agencies needed to respond with their budgets by October 11th to the governor, and that the council should consider themselves as a body that would put forward recommendations to the governor to inform his budget around the same time. And so we had kind of, I think the steering committee had been under the anticipation that they would have the fall to work through this process, but where we're at now is that there's a steering committee, there's a council meeting on September 12th, and then another one around the similar time frame in October. I can't remember the date. I think it's the second Monday in October. And by that second meeting in October, the council would consolidate a list of priorities to put forward in a memo to advance to the governor to inform his budget, and then hopefully also have extended life through the legislative process to sort of inform the budget from multiple directions. The steering committee at its meeting in August, therefore, then said we should hear from subcommittee co-chairs at the September meeting around a suite of priorities that need funding for the upcoming fiscal year. This funding would be available in fiscal year 24 that would align with ongoing implementation work that the council or state agencies are carrying out. It would also be an opportunity to think about programmatic funding. So, and this is where I don't feel like the guidance is explicitly clear. Like it's pretty easy to think about one-time funding to further support technical analyses that are needed, but then to pivot and think about funding to support programmatic implementation of strategies in the CAP is a little vaguer to me, and there hasn't been explicit guidance on that. But I will tell you that the other subcommittees have met. They have had a discussion around ongoing work, further analyses, and have their co-chairs are all planning to attend the meeting on September 12th and lift up a suite of priorities that range from, you know, funding community and public engagement to further studying different resilience and metrics and other components of work. And the hope is that will all come together at the September meeting, informed by guidance that the Agency of Natural Resources will prepare and support about our ongoing role and capacity with the work of the Climate Council. I think most people know that through the fiscal year 23 budget, the governor stood up a climate action office within the Agency of Natural Resources. Marion and I are both transitioning into new positions and are no longer direct administrative support for the council and subcommittees. I'll be transitioning into overseeing the Climate Action Office, and Marion will actually.
We lost you.
I think her earbuds died.
Oh, while we're waiting for her, Billy and Abby, did you know that the other subcommittees were kind of bringing these recommendations and prioritizations at the September meeting? And are we kind of behind? Should we be doing that as well as this subcommittee?
I think that's in part the intent of why we're meeting today and having this conversation started. I was peripherally aware about this process and I think all the subcommittees have kind of begun this work in the past couple of weeks. So we probably are behind, but I don't know that we're significantly behind. But I think our hope is that we can at least get the conversation started today and hopefully, move things forward. Even if we don't hit that September steering committee meeting, hopefully we can get to them before their October one with our recommendations.
Yeah, Alyssa,
Sorry,
I wasn't aware, but so I apologize. I would say we are behind, and I'm sorry that I haven't been more on top of that so that we could be better prepared to present those recommendations that I honestly didn't realize we were needing to do on the 12th.
sorry, I lost you all, but I'm back.
No problem. I think before you get started again, Judy has her hand up, so maybe Judy, feel free to ask your question or comment, and then we can go back to Jane.
Yeah, Jane, I'm a little confused by some of what you said, because the Biomass Task Force is not lifting up the recommendations from Ag and Eco. We have tabled them. I'm also confused because we had discussed at the last meeting, because we haven't had sufficient information, that we would not be ready to give budget figures except for a couple of specific items, like the survey.
Sure. So I'm happy to talk about biomass. I feel like this probably requires a robust conversation. I'm really glad that Billy and Abby put it as a topic, because I feel like there's still a lot of consternation about what that task group is doing. But and so why don't I just defer the biomass task group conversation to when we are going to talk about it, because I do want to make sure we give it ample time and don't really muddy the budget conversation with it. Even though I appreciate that there's also components of work from biomass that might need funding. And so I also appreciate that. I'll just say that for biomass, and we can talk about it more, I hope that we've been setting the expectation in that task group that we are not likely going to get to a finish line this fall, and that what we are lifting up in October isn't the final recommendations likely, but an understanding of what we've learned, what we're able to say by then, and then the next steps to sort of speak to the council and update them on what we've done to date and what the task group would recommend continuing on. And so hopefully we can talk about that process with this group today. But when I talk about the substantive work being prepared and presented in October, it's just my understanding that it's likely for biomass going to be like a status report. Like, this is what we can say, this is what we can't say yet, and this is our recommendation to continue the process in these ways. So hopefully that's what I'm starting to see with biomass, and we can talk about that. As far as the budget, there are going to be multiple ways to inform budget conversations. The legislative process is one that is independent of this conversation, and the governor's budget is just another. And so the council will lift up a memo in October to inform the governor's budget. That doesn't mean there can't be other priorities that get lifted up later and come in different ways to inform funding. And this timeline is unfortunate, it's short. We've been sharing updates with co-chairs starting in August when this came to light and via email, but this weird, this is going to get lifted up through the budget process. It's a transition, a pivot right now around support for the council from the Agency of Natural Resource, and process, especially around budget drivers, really need to come from the council and subcommittees. So we're doing our best to help relay that information that's coming out of the steering committee, but asking subcommittees and council to drive that process. And so I can help inform questions, but really it's varying levels of input and engagement from subcommittees. And for September, it's really not a be all end all. It's here's what work we are doing as a subcommittee, the work that aligns and the work that likely needs funding. And what I hope the council will be able to get to is a target and a driver of how that message will be framed that subcommittees can then look at in September to further refine any priorities for that final memo in October. So as Billy said, I don't think you have to, or I don't think you have to feel behind. This is a start of a conversation, and hopefully more guidance through a process and deliberative conversation with the council in September will inform what happens between September and October.
Thanks, Jane. And so what I'm hearing from this is that we have a little bit of time to come up with budget funding recommendations and priorities, that there's a couple of different forms of recommendations. One may be for additional analysis or studies that we believe are necessary to support the priorities of our subcommittee, many of which are already moving forward through some of the RFPs that are underway. The one we discussed this morning, the life cycle emissions, broader GHG RFP that is under development, et cetera. If there's additional kind of analysis that can be funded with one-time spending that we think is critical to our work, I think we've got some weeks to try to identify those. Similarly, if there are kind of implementation priorities, if there are action items that we had included in the climate action plan that we think are, important actions that need state funding in the coming fiscal year, I think we have an opportunity to try to identify those and recommend them to the council, and hopefully have them include them in their budget proposal. So that's based on kind of what I know about the process, kind of where we're at. What are the studies and one-time sorts of funding that we want to see happen? What are the action items we want to see implemented in the next fiscal year, and the dollars that go along with those? And we may not have good answers to that. It may be that a lot of the work that we've prioritized is either ongoing, has other funding sources, or maybe there's some clearer things that don't. So I think, and Jane, I know we're not trying to kind of rely on you for guidance here. This is kind of our process now, but if I have that kind of wrong, I'd appreciate you clarifying it. Okay, so I think that's where we're at. So I think we've got some time today to kind of start to talk about that process. I think we could certainly try to schedule another subcommittee meeting, either before the council's September meeting, or certainly before the October meeting, to kind of come up with our punch list to pass on to them. So would invite folks' thoughts, recommendations there.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how much time it's taken often for our group to come to consensus around shared priorities, and how big our long list was. So I think scheduling meetings seems like a good idea. It sounds like this is a window of time to at least elevate some of the priorities that we've identified as a group, and just look back at the previous work that we've done. And even if it doesn't perfectly align with what other folks' priorities are, I think we should at least just use the opportunity to elevate some of the work that we did last year. And yeah, I know it's hard to get meetings on people's schedules. When you said September 12th, that's yeah. I think we should
will share that other subcommittees have used this as a brainstorming session, and then asked smaller groups to inform the ask in a memo, and then have brought it back to a subcommittee. So if there is an interest in lifting up or furthering thinking about the substantive work that this group is engaged in and funding needs through a conversation today, then perhaps a smaller group could sort of work on that and then bring it back to the full subcommittee.
From a process standpoint of doing that, and to Alyssa's point of, how long it can take to reach some notion of collective priorities and alignment. It would be helpful if we had those recommendations in a spreadsheet, and then maybe individual members could identify in between our meeting time the things for them that are like their pick 5 of your top priorities, and we could kind of start to see where there's maybe where we're starting to align around certain things, or where we're just not, and how to sort of reach consensus then if we're all over the place. But I would imagine, yeah, that there's got to be some level of gravity around certain recommendations, but just a process to help us get there a little faster, and in between meetings, something like that, I think could be helpful.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion, Jake. I'm just pulling up the climate action plan right now to see if, I don't think there was any like summary matrix of all the recommendations, but I might be wrong about that.
Yeah, that's why I bring that up, because that just in terms of navigating it, a lot of our recommendations I feel like are in different, even like different sections that you have to scroll through many pages to see collectively. So
yeah, fair point. We can think about, I can dig back to see if we as a subcommittee generated any documents that have all of our stuff in one place before it was kind of meshed into the climate action plan, and that might be a good matrix to work off of. So I'm happy to do that later today. Otherwise, it may just be kind of working through the plan itself and kind of identifying priority actions by their kind of, pathway, strategy, and action number, and name. And then, at least that would be a consistent framework for identifying things. But yeah, I think for future plans, it'd be great to see if like all the action items kind of in one chart, so that we could kind of have it as a menu to pick from in a more consolidated way.
I will just say that we have an intern, hopefully this fall, who will be working with us to think about how we track actions associated with the climate action plan and start to have an easier place to turn to look at all these things and actually see where things are getting movement and not. So that's something that we very much think is our responsibility to do on your behalf, and are hoping to do that this fall. I see Marianne has her hand up, so she might have something to add.
Yeah, I'm on the way to an appointment, so can't share it right now, but we did compile for you all of your actions into an Excel spreadsheet. It's broken out by tab, so every pathway is a different tab, but happy to share that later this afternoon with you, Billy, to circulate.
That'd be super.
That'd be
Thanks,
great.
Marion. Yeah, so I think maybe we look to see what that looks like and try to use that as the vehicle for identifying specific actions that we want to elevate for a funding recommendation. And then we can compile those, and we should talk now about how we want to kind of move that stuff forward. But before we do, if we could just pause this conversation quickly and welcome Sonia Riley to our meeting. Hey, Sonia. We may not have a ton of time with Sonia, so I want to just kind of, if it's okay with folks, kind of pause this conversation briefly, welcome her to the group, maybe introduce ourselves, hear a little bit about her, and then we can get back to the budgeting conversation if that's okay. Great.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I'm Sonia. I'm an 11th grader at Essex High School, and I'm really excited to be on the subcommittee. For a while, I've been interested in climate change and protecting our planet and preserving the land that we do have. But I've kind of taken more of like an activist side of things and focused more on what I could do personally. And now I kind of want to just like try new things and get involved with maybe more what our legislation can do and how that can shape policy and create new programs that we can implement. And I'm really excited to kind of take it from a legislative perspective instead of like an activist perspective.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Sonia, for your interest in working with the Climate Council and the subcommittee and joining us today. I know Abby and I had a chance to meet you earlier and introduce ourselves. And we don't have the full subcommittee here, but we've got a pretty good representation. So maybe other subcommittee members who are present could just introduce yourself to Sonia and tell her a little bit about yourselves, if that's okay. let's see, Judy, you want to go first?
Hello, Sonia. I am the executive director of Gadakana. I also live in Essex. I live in the town, and I'm an educator, and yeah, nice to meet you. Happy to be looking forward to working with you.
Let's see, Jake.
Hi, Sonia. Jake Claro. I'm the Farm to Plate Director at the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund. And yeah, Farm to Plate is, so our state has a 10-year food system strategic plan, which I help to administer. And the Farm to Plate Network is the body that is responsible for implementation of that. So I kind of manage that as well. Nice to meet you.
Thanks, Jake. Alyssa.
Hi, Sonia. Thanks for joining our group. My name is Alyssa White. I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Vermont. I work with the Gund Institute for Environment and UVM Extension on climate change and soil carbon and climate adaptation research.
Thanks, Alyssa. And Ryan.
Sorry, trying to unmute there. Hi, Sonia, nice to meet you. Ryan Patch with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. Work at the agency is, with agriculture, significant focus on ag mitigation strategies, also working on building resilience, both within the working landscape and, on farms themselves. So a lot of emphasis on agriculture and food systems in some of the climate change strategies that are out there, maybe needed for the future. And it's been a pretty engaging group to be working with over the past year. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Ryan. And, we've got a few subcommittee members who aren't with us today. Lauren Oates, who is with the Vermont Nature Conservancy, David Mears with Vermont Audubon, and Charlie Hancock, who is a consulting forester up in northern Vermont. So we're kind of working through our agenda right now, Sonia, and talking about a process to identify priority action items out of the climate action plan that we want the Climate Council to consider in a budget funding request for the legislature and the governor this coming fiscal year. And we found out about this a little bit late in the process, so we're trying to improvise and come up with a process to kind of move that conversation forward. So, certainly please stick with us as long as you can. We're going to kind of grind through these topics. And then certainly as we schedule future meetings, Abby and I will try to do a better job kind of reaching out to you to make sure we can schedule them in a time that works for you. But anything else you want to kind of hear from us or share before we kind of resume our programming here?
No, I'm good. I just think for the first couple meetings, I might listen a little bit more, just so I kind of get the feel of what the subcommittee is like. That's okay.
That's a great approach. Absolutely okay. So thank you. Okay, great. So kind of, I think where we left off, Jane put in the chat, so I should have known that our wonderful staff had already done the thing that I had asked for. There appears to be this matrix in the plan, one of the appendices that includes for each pathway that basically has all the action items together. So maybe this is the tool that we can use to identify the priority actions for each of us in the group, and maybe just cite the kind of pathway strategy, whatever nomenclature are used in these matrices, we can use those to identify our priority actions. Does that work for folks? Okay. And then let's see. So the Climate Council's meeting on September 12th, then they're meeting again on October 17th. I think ideally, if we could get a first cut to them on September 12th, that's great. If that's just not going to work, I think if we try to get something in kind of like to the steering committee or somebody well in advance of their October meeting, that would hopefully give them enough time to incorporate into their thinking. But what do folks think? Do we want to try to share your recommendations with Abby and I, like over email, kind of prior to the climate council meeting on the 12th, and we could try to do some work on our end to kind of reconcile those and just work on behalf of the subcommittee to try to elevate up what seem to be the kind of priority recommendations? Or do we want to find a time to try to get together before then? Or do we just say that September 12th meeting is too soon and we're going to just need to do our work after that and make sure we get something to the council before October? Yeah, Alyssa, please.
Yeah, thanks for offering to do the, the coordinating work, Abby and Billy. I wonder if it might be helpful to like email the whole subcommittee and give everybody a week to read through the matrix, and like maybe that's emailing you and Abby our list of things that we see as important to elevate in the near term, and then we can use that kind of winnowed list of each person's called out ones to kind of meet and discuss from. I don't know. That'd be a bit of work on your end to kind of compile everybody's votes essentially. But it might be nice to like ask everybody to look at the matrix and go through it in advance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. And I think you're throwing in the idea of doing that, then trying to get back together as a group to kind of look at that winnowed list. And I'm willing to do that. I just know that everyone's busy. So want to be deferential to you all about how you want to proceed, whether we think we can get another meeting in sometime before September 12th, sometime, next week, essentially. I think it would be a shorter one. Certainly it wouldn't be 2 hours, maybe half hour, 45 minutes, but what do folks think? And Abby, I think he just popped on camera here, so what's going on?
I'm wondering if it makes sense, since Jane said that we have a little bit more time, or that it sounds like the October 17th is more the like real deadline. Am I interpreting that correctly? That maybe we don't rush to try to get another meeting in before the 12th, but instead do what we talked about of circulating the matrices and all trying to sort of, we've been away from this work for a while. And so let's refamiliarize ourselves with where we were. And then you and I can compile maybe the themes that come forward from what everybody sends us, and then make sure that we have another meeting prior to the October 17th meeting to make sure that, we're all on the same page as to how we suggest those recommendations move forward.
I think that makes good sense. So that makes, if everyone is kind of generally in agreement with that process, we can send an email out summarizing that after day. We'll include the matrices as a kind of standalone document for folks, or link to it or something. And then we'll give some kind of directions on timeline for sharing your priorities with Abby and I over email. And then we can look to schedule something kind of later this month, near the end of September, to kind of get back together to look at those. Poor Abby. Does that sound good to folks? Okay, seeing some nods. And Sonia, we can grab some time with you kind of offline to talk you through all this stuff. And, obviously feel free to participate in this to the extent you have the time and interest, but you're obviously joining something midstream. So no expectations on you to do anything beyond what you're comfortable with. Okay. Well, others, if we want to talk about this more or have additional thoughts, we've got a little bit of time, but otherwise, I think that sounds like a great plan, Abby, and something that we can send some more clear directions around after the meeting today. Anything else? Ryan.
Yeah, question for group and others in thinking about program implementation and development. Is this one-off funding for specific projects that the steering committee or climate council has asked for or is looking for? Because just to share that long-term implementation of natural and working lands practices and programs often require multi-year funding to be effective and scale up and get those programs developed and on the ground. And so thinking about program administration and development, I wanted to better understand the bounds of programming that folks are thinking of, and just to raise that kind of longer term funding prerogatives for, or need really, for natural and working land programming specifically. You don't change management overnight. It often takes many years.
Yeah, that's a good question, Ryan. I don't know that I have a clear answer. I think, as Jane put in the chat, if there's existing programs that folks think are effective that may need future funding in the upcoming fiscal year, kind of a continuance of that funding is an easy way to keep momentum. I think this is about budgeting for one fiscal year, but as you know, many programs need to kind of happen over on an ongoing basis, and then they just, they have to come back each year to get funded. So I think this is about identifying the things that are the priorities and that we want to either continue or initiate funding for in fiscal 24, and then, hopefully maintain support for going forward. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, yeah. I just wanted to share from my experience the accountability framework for PMDL work from EPA, and I'm not proposing or suggesting this. I'm just sharing that one of the components was a permanent long-term funding source, right? If you don't have that for multi-year implementation, especially for 2030, 2050 type things, I'm not suggesting that should be part of this conversation, but when we think about program development and implementation, that just 1 year of effort often is not very effective. It often takes multiple years for land-based management to change. So, just wanted to throw that consideration out there for folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, folks should keep that in mind when they're going through the matrix. And if there are priority actions that, are anticipated needing ongoing support, we should flag those for the council and the recommendations. Abby, I'm going to give you co-chair prerogative to jump in. And then Marley, I see your hands up. So we're just going to hear from Abby, then go to you.
I just wanted to add, Ryan, thank you so much for bringing that up. I wonder if that's something we want to tackle as a portion of conversation for a meeting a little bit further down the road too. We've been talking about this within Organic Valley as we're attempting to set up our carbon insetting program, and sort of the trickiness of the natural and working lands programs that tend to come up in the fact that, the farmers and foresters, et cetera, the folks working in those sectors need to have assurances about their viability as when they're going to pursue these management changes, because it often is not something that's compensated for in what they're being paid for in their product. And also just, wanting to truly capture, what is it going to take to truly capture the benefits from those practices, and how do we set up programs that ensure the viability of the work and the management practices that we want to happen, and also the viability and the sustainability of the people who are trying to do it. And so I think that there's more of a conversation there in terms of how we can help, maybe in the legislature this year, some of the legislators understand the ways in which we might need to think differently, or how we could think differently about funding, appropriations, et cetera, for some of these projects
for climate, particularly in the natural and working land sectors, if that makes sense.
Great. Thanks, Abby. It's good. All these pieces kind of work together, identifying priorities and ongoing kind of aware education and lobbying of lawmakers. Marley, your hand's been up. Want to jump in here?
Yeah, sure. I guess I'm just curious if Jane or others have any guidance on any structures around requesting funds. I should probably know this, but I mean, are we just able to suggest anything? Is one can ask for $5 million, but one is far more likely to get 100,000. Or is there any recommendation on types of requests? Are we just focusing on modeling? Could we request $1 million to do some in-field research of exact practices or things that can make a difference, and how to quantify them in-field versus modeling? What strings, so to speak, do we have on any of this?
So again, this is a process outside of the state process, so it's complementary. And I see kind of the council's request as advisory to the governor, and it would be advisory to ANR and our considerations too. But there is a substantial amount of one-time funding this year, and that's really what this is centered around. And so it's not about building long-term capacity, it's about one-time funding use, and that can be in the form of technical analysis or modeling. I certainly think that could be in the form of one-time projects that are in the field that support our understanding and advancement of practices and work that informs those strategies and actions of the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee. The ranges of asks from other subcommittees are cross sectors meeting next week. They specifically, rather than looking across all of their strategies and actions, ask their task groups specifically to think about work that they need to further the momentum and actions in those components of areas, and those task groups are meeting, and then the subcommittee's coming together next week to review those and have TJ and Rich put that forward. Just Transitions have roughly $1.5 million total in like 7 to 8 different components of work that they're asking for. And all of this is to say that right now there isn't guidance on specific amounts or ask. And I think that is, if the council's successful in forming a process and a target informed by a memo around agency capacity to support and stand up that work, that is the goal of the September meeting, is to take the sort of spaghetti at the wall, have clear guidance based on what the target is, and then refine that ask for October. So I'm sorry that I don't have a lot more details to offer.
So yeah, I think in summary, things that are discrete in nature that have a limited duration, like additional study or a project that can be completed in one budget cycle, probably have more potential to be funded than those that require that are kind of new programs, new staffing that require ongoing funding. But I think we and the council, you're free to recommend whatever you think is a priority, and the governor will do what he does with that recommendation. Presumably the council will independently advocate for certain funding through the legislative appropriation process as well. So I think, I'm sure the council is looking for what this group thinks is the best recommendations, notwithstanding kind of the viability of the funding solutions. Listen.
Yeah, and this is really helpful to know that there's kind of this like clear window where short-term funding could potentially be successful, but it could also really be helpful for our committee, who is really, we're charged with kind of being responsible for advancing this in work, to think about the long-term funding needs as well. So having that conversation about everything and what's on people's minds in terms of priorities can be helpful for when we get asked those questions a little farther down the line, and it won't be as much of a scramble to be like, oh, we've got to come up with our recommendations right now. I could see, yeah. So I think, highlighting the opportunity window for the short-term funding, but also just having a general conversation about what we think is important to advocate for. And maybe we'll see other opportunities to ask for funding elsewhere that could complement this work. And then we'll just kind of be poised to say that has this body's support and advocacy behind it.
Great. Yeah, and this is, in my mind, this is like a little of the work that we didn't get to last year because we ran out of time, the prioritization. We did great work in getting a very robust group of recommended actions together for the plan. And then we didn't really have the time to go back and say, well, if we had our druthers, which would we put resources behind? So we can kind of start that conversation now, both for what's possible in the coming fiscal year, but then just more broadly about the things that this group thinks collectively are most important. Jane.
Yeah, that was really good context, Billy, after Alyssa. And I was just going to say that Alyssa's comments are really on point, I think, because at the steering committee meeting, the steering committee member, Councillor Duval, brought up the aspect of speaking to one-time funding needs, but also not letting go of that prioritization of what needs long-term funding. Weatherization is a really good example that comes up. We're sort of have this bridge funding for the next few years through all the federal investments, but we know that we're going to staff up workforce, staff up homeowners' interest in this, and there's a cliff in a few years for how we fund weatherization. So we can't wait till we get there. We need to be thinking about how we fund those long-term strategies and programs now. And I think that speaking to the work that Ag and Eco didn't really get to after the plan, further prioritizing your recommendations and actions and then aligning those with funding opportunities as time and funding allows is a really great next step for this. So.
Thanks, Sonia. Great to see you. We'll shoot you an email with some more info, and we'll try to make it so you can join us in the future and enjoy the first week of school.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so are we in a good place with this conversation? Abby and I will get out, we'll kind of summarize what we all agreed to as far as process in an email. We'll look for a time to meet later in September and share any additional kind of guidance that might have gone to the council on this topic. But if there's more we want to talk about now, please feel free to. All right. Silent stares suggest that I think we're ready to move on. So good, we got a game plan. And let's see. So the next topic on our agenda is the Biomass Tasker. And we talked about some of this a little bit earlier, but I think, as you all know, Judy, Charlie, and myself are the Ag and Ecosystems representatives on that task group. That includes members from cross-sector and science and data subcommittees as well. I think Judy and Jane both gave some good context for kind of where we're at with that work. But, Judy, if you want to take some more time to kind of share your observations of where things stand. I know that, from your view, the group hasn't fully engaged in all of the tabled actions out of the subcommittee. So, if that's something you want to share more about with the group, please feel free to.
Sure, and it's not from my observations, Billy. Our recommendations were tabled. The first couple of meetings were designed to discuss our scope of work, and it was brought to the comment council, and biofuels were left out of any discussion. It was only biomass that was put in there. And it's been a struggle for me and for others because our presenters have been presenting a one-sided story. And there seems to be a lot of lobbying behind the scenes going on to have only one side presented. And when there are other presenters recommended, time becomes an issue. First we're told yes, then we're told maybe, then we're told no. And so we've gotten to the point where this last meeting we just had, someone said, I can't make a decision until I have all the answers. So there are gaps in our knowledge, and we're hoping to get speakers in there to fill those gaps.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's true, that clearly this is a complicated topic and it's got a lot of different pieces that touch on both climate and environment and health and justice. And I think we've heard from a number of people, and there's an interest from hearing from more folks and from different perspectives. And I think that's some of the work we are going to be doing into the fall, and in part why I think, as Jane indicated, it's likely we're going to provide more of a status update to the council in October rather than a formal set of recommendations. And, as far as tabling some of the recommendations that came out of this group, I think that is true. The conversation that was had at the task group was that some of those items that we suggested were really ripe for discussion for a couple of reasons. The use of wood fuel at the residential level had already been included in the climate action plan's recommendation for a clean heat standard, where it was clear that that was one of the fuels that was anticipated for inclusion in that program. So, short of the council choosing to revisit that recommendation, it didn't seem like it was the best use of the task group's time to dig into that. The other one was around the net greenhouse gas emission impacts of electric-led electric from wood generation, and that there's an RFP out for that life cycle analysis work to be done. And many folks on the task group felt that we would need that data to really inform an ultimate recommendation. So that action item from this group was tabled until that work was completed. So I think we were left with 2 of the 4 or 3 of the 5 action items that the task group is continuing to look at related to the ongoing operation of the McNeil and Ragate plants, the procurement of wood fuel for things like pellets in Vermont and the associated forest health and other impacts associated with that. And then, the needs around outreach and engagement with affected communities on this topic. So I think, we've met quite a bit. There's been a lot of conversation. I think there's clearly the need for more. And I think we're working to kind of continue to schedule new and additional voices in the conversation going forward. So I don't know if folks have questions or Judy, if you have more you want to add or share or kind of engage this group around. But I think we're still chugging along is really where it's at.
One suggestion was to have people from the impacted community hear their voices, but that's been turned around to become a survey. So no, Jane?
No, not at all, Judy. I don't think. I think that what we talked about, you, myself, the public engagement, community engagement task group, is that a one-off listening session would not be valuable, largely because of the mistrust between the state, these communities, years and generations of challenges within this impacted community around McNeil, and to go in and ask them specifically about McNeil would feel out of blue, out of context. So what we suggested, I thought this was with your support. So if it's not, please check me. But I thought the idea was to have a peer-to-peer survey, community delivered, around larger climate issues that also spoke to McNeil as a way to engage the community of the Old North End around the impacts of McNeil, but also the more broad climate impacts. And then hear from that survey, use likely the Boys and Girls Club, which is the trusted community nexus there, to host a event where we talked about the survey and responses, and then committed to long-term engagement with the Old North End as a targeted community for us around McNeil, but also around more climate-related issues. And so that that is a recommendation in Just Transitions, to think about how we fund that work long-term and think about how we put boots on the ground. So it wasn't that we didn't want to do it, it was that we needed to do it bigger.
I agree what you're saying, but I also feel that listening to people from those, having someone speak from that community was kind of put off the table as a speaker for the committee.
Oh, I don't think so. I don't,
Okay,
I
so
didn't know that.
We can recommend somebody from, because you were saying we didn't have room for more speakers.
No, we're meeting weekly now in September in response to all the speakers that people have been suggesting to me. I mean, I'm coordinating. I mean, every task group member is sending me speakers. So I'm doing my best to listen, to vet and speak to them personally, but I've had countless speakers recommended to me, and I'm sorry if it feels biased, but I really am trying my best to bring in a varied perspective to the committee.
Well, thank you both for that. It's important work. Yes.
Is this an area where we should be recommending additional or putting forward additional requests for funding, whether for, I mean, it sounds like the Just Transition had within their funding for strategic community engagement, but is there a component of this perhaps that we should pull out? And I haven't been keeping good track of this, but certainly I have about 1 million concerns about biofuels and sort of the ramifications that they will have on Vermont's agricultural sector because of the ways in which those systems are set up federally. And so that's a little bit different than a life cycle analysis, for example. And so I'm wondering, might that be a place where our committee thinks there's a shorter term sort of request for funding that could go into our thinking or ask?
It's a great idea, Abby. I was just going to say that the biofuels conversation that was considered as an expansion to the scope of the Woody Biomass Task Group, the steering committee took that up and said that because we were doing the life cycle analysis, that we should wait for the life cycle analysis and see about what further work needs to be done for biofuels. I also think that that doesn't preclude you all from thinking about that now, especially if it's complementary or outside of scope of a life cycle analysis, so that we have some further data, understanding, applied knowledge to inform, especially likely, a reinvigorated consideration for how we reduce emissions in our buildings and thermal sector this legislative session. There's likely robust discourse and analysis that could go into biofuels beyond the life cycle analysis.
Thanks, Jane.
I agree with that, Abby, because the estimated time that we were given for when the biofuels life cycle analysis would be done was a year. So I agree, there should be some discussion. It seems like not appropriate to put it on a shelf for a year.
Well, it's certainly a topic that I guess I would say that I was peripherally aware of its realities before we sort of stopped meeting as a group, but during the legislative, it became clear that it's something that I think we do really need to sort of assess more deeply within our subcommittee at a certain point, so that our perspective can be interwoven into
and what you're oops, sorry. What you're seeing here is what's happening. So we specifically asked Jane what the estimate would be. We were told 1 year, and now she puts in the cycle and says the life cycle analysis will be done in March. This is typically what happens. We get an estimate for something, we work with that in mind. Stop it, Jane. That is so disrespectful.
Judy, you're on the task group for the life cycle analysis. It was in the spring that we started talking about this. I'm sorry that I do not mean to disrespect you, but you just reviewed the proposals with me, and we just selected a contractor, and the contract goes through March. So that's
Right.
all why I'm putting it in here. It's just been months that we've been in the proposal writing, so the time has languished, and we're here in the fall. But the work itself will be done in the spring.
Okay, so I think, Abby, that was a good, good observation that biofuels generally is a topic. Non-woody biofuels is a topic that probably warrants more discussion by this group because it's not nesting, fully within the woody biomass task group.
Yeah, I don't think we have to and it could be even, I mean, maybe down the road, it's something that needs its own sort of separate task group, because I think the majority of how it's been talked about has been that we haven't really grappled with the full nuances of the biofuels conversation. And so just, maybe we should put a little marker on we talk about down the road.
Good. I'm just taking minutes as we go along here, so sorry if I drift out occasionally to type. Okay. Judy, is that hand up? Do you have anything more you want to share or discuss right now?
No, it doesn't. It's not beneficial to say anything because everything I say is contradicted or made fun of. Thank you.
Okay. Other thoughts from folks? I think Judy, as a co-chair of this task group and a member of the subcommittee and of the biomass task group, certainly if there's ways that you feel like you're not being heard or additional speakers or resources you want to bring to the group, I'm happy to try to help with that. So please let me know. Okay. So, as kind of expected, this has presented as a complex topic with a lot of different challenges and detailed aspects associated with it. We notwithstanding the need to hear from many folks, I think we've probably heard from a half a dozen experts from various universities and industry representatives, et cetera, so far. So we have gotten a fair amount of information. We'll hopefully get more. And we'll continue to move forward with their work and bring back an update to this group probably the next time we meet later in September. Anything else about Biomass Task Group before we move on? Okay. So now we have, excuse me, we just had a block of time on the agenda. If there's anything else, since we all haven't been together for a while, if there's anything else we want to discuss as a group or folks want to share or ask questions of or recommend, If we don't have anything, that's fine, but we wanted to just have a spot for an open discussion of any relevant topics since we're together. So I don't personally have anything, but if there's anything any of you would like to kind of raise with the group, do it. And if not, we can move on to public comment and wind things down a little early. So any issues du jour for folks today? Okay. If something comes to mind, oh, here, yeah, go ahead, Abby.
Just to add a little levity, I'm watching my dad bake, and he just let one out of the baler that almost rolled halfway down the hill, but he caught it anyway.
Well, if you see your car shake, we know you got hit by one. Okay, good. Well, thank you. All right, well, I think, I'm sure we've got some folks here from the public who kind of want to share their thoughts, so we'll move on to that. But if any subcommittee members do have something that you want to discuss with the group before we adjourn, feel free to just raise your hand and we can work that into the conversation. So we're going to move on to public comment. So as we have in the past, would folks who would like to speak, please raise your Zoom hand or otherwise alert us of your interest. So I see Cheryl and Annette. Annette, why don't you go ahead?
Hello. So I've been attending the Biomass Task Group meetings, and something that I think is important for this subcommittee to actually discuss and take up. I'm especially concerned about all the pieces that aren't really fitting together in this work around biomass and also biofuels, where I have, I guess, I expect that the clean heat standard is going to come back to the legislature in January. Meanwhile, there's this life cycle analysis that's not going to be ready for the next legislative session. And I recently saw a rather scathing report from NESCOM about the EPA's standards for outdoor wood boilers and wood burning stoves. That, here we are looking at advanced wood heat as part of a clean heat standard. And yet I'm not convinced that, especially seeing this report by NESCOM, that this is something that we should be promoting in Vermont without a further evaluation of whether or not the air quality issues associated with the certifications that are being done by EPA are actually protective of and do what are being claimed. So I just want to flag that as sort of a disconnect. Okay, we've got this already baked clean heat standard that has as part of it advanced wood heat. Then we have the biofuel component, which according to an evaluation done by 350 Vermont, more than 50% of the clean heat standard would be met by biofuels. Yet nobody on no subcommittee on the Climate Council has actually talked about biofuels. Where and when is that conversation going to happen? And how can, I heard this idea that, the Climate Council would have to revisit withdrawing its support of the clean heat standard before, and I think that ought to be a topic of discussion at a council meeting, that this Climate Council has not done the work necessary to support that policy. And in the cross-sector mitigation or steering committee meetings, I've been following all these and they get sort of jumbled in my mind, or the full council meetings, it's been acknowledged that there are, for instance, challenges with bringing forward this some other policies that, you don't want to run into the same problem you had with the clean heat standard, where we didn't do the cost evaluations. And I'm pointing out that there are actual evaluations relevant to this subcommittee where this conversation should be taking place that have not taken place and are not taking place at the Biomass Task Group. There is an opportunity for further evaluation of some of these things in the Biomass Task Group, but actually the standards that EPA has set for advanced wood heating, or whatever you want to call it, are not a topic of discussion at the Biomass Task Group now because it's solely focused on the use of biomass for electric generation. So that Biomass Task Group has been narrowed and narrowed and narrowed to the point that who's talking about the things that aren't being talked about, that should be talked about. So that's my observation that I hope is helpful to share with you. And in some way of a red flag, don't expect that something like the clean heat standard in its current version is going to come back and receive a good reception. It's only going to get more criticism if this climate council doesn't do its homework. And I also kind of wonder what sort of time frame the council has overall. I mean, is there some rush? I think on the budget, yes, for the next legislative session. But in general, I don't really understand what the plan is for the climate council, and I'm very disappointed that the work, all the really hard work that this subcommittee did, has not really achieved the relevance that it should have. And one of the things that I would like this climate council or this subcommittee to ask of the full council, and Chris Campany has said it too, is, and he's leaving, but he said it at one of the last either steering committee or full council meetings, this climate council needs to go to the legislature and ask for a change in the Global Warming Solutions Act to place values for, to value things other than emissions reductions. And what this subcommittee is doing needs to have its work valued equivalent to emissions reductions. And I think I've asked this before, and I will probably say it again, because as Cheryl Choi and I have noted, generally when we say things in public comment, they are just going into a black hole, and there is now an agreement or an effort to actually respond to public comment in some way. And so I appreciate that, and we'll see how that goes, but please discuss this at your next meeting. What does this subcommittee want to see? And also I'll look at the makeup of it. Mostly I'm seeing state agency people on this. What happened to the actual membership of the committee that's not state agency people? And that's nothing disrespectful to all of you who are in state agencies, but that's not really how I thought that this was going to be. And we're missing Audubon, we're missing, so I just think we need some more people added to this subcommittee that are actual, like Abby, real world people who live in the real world and don't just function in a bureaucracy. Thank you for hearing my comments.
Thanks, Nat. Yeah, it's great to hear that there's some process in place to try to be responsive to comments, because I do think that makes sense. And, we have Abby, who is a member of the council that hopefully can, elevate those thoughts up. And you have been, so I know you have been. So I just mean you can continue to, is what I'm gonna say.
Thank you, Billy. I was gonna say, and that I feel your frustrations. I quite honestly, I have tried as hard as I can to be effective within the council, and I've pretty much failed. I think I don't, and I'm now, just to be completely frank, we're running this farm that used to be run by 6 people as 3 people. And so I don't even have the bandwidth that I had for the last year to give to this process that, requires a lot of the people who have to be at the table. I don't really know what to do with that. I will continue to try to advocate for the needs and priorities of our community, but Chris Campany and I have spoken about this a lot, and I am very concerned that he's leaving. I understand why, but I'm concerned, and I don't know how to elevate the the fact that I agree that I think that the Global Warming Solutions Act was, needs to be revisited to better address the needs that I think we all agree are so prominent in the realms of adaptation and resilience, and the metrics by which we would meet them. But as to how to get from here to there, I will keep trying as much as I can as a counselor, but I'm one of 22 or whatever.
Thanks, Abby. Okay, Cheryl, you have your hand up. Floor is yours.
Thanks, Billy. I want to first respond to the very last thing that Annette said, which was that talking about how the council is supposedly changing the way public comment is addressed, taken, discussed, etc. So since this is early, rather than shutting down early, how about you all stay on until the end of the meeting and have conversation, together with the public and addressing the issues that, any of the public brings up, and actually have conversation, because it would be great to have conversation back and forth. And that way it would be useful public comment. So I request that anybody else respond to Annette and me and whoever else is going to say anything. And what I want to tell you is that that Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee has hasn't looked at research and data that have already been generated about the carbon sequestration and storage for all the various natural ecosystems that are out here in Vermont, and come up with recommendations to protect and restore and increase them, and also talk about reduction in consumption. And I think this is part of where it's more than what Annette said, which is part of more than just reducing the numbers of emissions, because this would reduce emissions, but we all know that, and we can account for it later, but we all know that this needs to be done. And aside from this, scientists of us that realize that, it's also common sense. But look at existing research already done, because it's out there, and somebody just needs to coalesce it. Reducing emissions and increasing storage and sequestration will do that for us with using the natural lands. That brings up another thing, which is I think it would be important to separate natural lands from working lands. And I also think that the phrase working lands should be changed, because natural lands do just as much work as, lands that humans work. So I don't think that that's a good way to talk about the different lands. So separating out natural lands from working lands, and also in the recommendations, you should separate them out and address them differently, because they do different things and they act differently, and they should be treated differently. Let's see. About the speakers and the Biomass Task Group, all the speakers that have been allowed to speak so far and been allowed to present have been those who advocate in favor of the use of biomass and biofuels. None of them have been allowed that advocate against the use of biofuels or biomass, none. And nor those who discuss the negative effects of biomass use and biofuels. So, and there is a lot out there. And now there are more on the slate to present that are also in favor of using biomass and biofuels. And it's just presenter after presenter showing that there's nothing wrong with biomass and biofuels. or that there's no data for it. And then and nothing about the information that it is negative for, like, for example, for human health, or not just human health, but for health of air quality that affects more than humans. Numerous researchers and data show negative health effects that have not been looked at, that show the ways that burning biomass is worse than burning coal. The two, Reigate and McNeil, are at best, I think one of them is 23% efficient, and I don't know what the other is, but they're very inefficient. And and again, the time period was extended for Reigate, and the information about not using biomass is being ignored and just not looked at and refused to be presented. We also need to talk about, in this subcommittee, and all of the subcommittees need to talk about reduction of consumption. A handful of people talk about this, but nothing comes out in recommendations, and nothing comes out in legislator, and nobody talks about it. All right, I say nobody. It's not true, not nobody, but very few people. I think that's it. And I would like to be able to be giving you my recommendations as well as what to bring forward from the matrix. I'm going to send that, and I hope you will use it.
Thank you. Cheryl.
I'd like to have people talk about the things that I said and that said, please.
Sure. Well, I'm going to just see if there's anyone else from the public that would like to speak right now. Okay, there isn't. And I'll just kick it off. And I guess I'll just ask Cheryl. I know that the Biomass Task Group heard from the Vermont Department of Health around the air quality impacts associated with the combustion of wood fuel and the negative health consequences associated with that. So I think we did spend a significant amount of time looking at that. But if there's more there, it would be good to understand kind of what the gaps are. I think we also heard from Collins about the emissions associated with the wood-fired fuel plant. So I don't think there hasn't been information presented on the factual, real impacts to emissions and health associated with the combustion of wood fuel. Maybe more could be, maybe more is needed, but I do think that there's been some effort to get that information to the task group.
Only information that would be beneficial for Reigate and McNeil and biomass burning in general. Because for one thing, there are no monitors on the top of the stacks. There are monitors down at the bottom of the stacks. Well, there are no monitors downwind and where the emissions are going. You've only heard from people we heard from people from Reigate, and the Vermont Department of Health didn't give all of the information. They didn't even have information. They had a lack of information, and there's information all over the place that you easily can access about the very bad impacts of 2.5 particle size on the asthma and COPD and all of the health implications from lung issues all increase when it's in fall and winter while there's wood burning going on by everybody's houses. And so that's a really big issue. I don't have the data here. I can't give it to you now. I can send you some, but are you going to look at it? But I don't want to just send it and put it into the place where the public is allowed to go ahead and put documents on, because nobody looks at it. Nobody talks about it. And I'd like to have it discussed here. So you guys have to find it and you guys have to talk about it. Or the Biomass Task Group has to be allowed to talk about it. And there have been speakers, presenters, that are very well respected that have been refused because they're going to point to a different thing of answers that you don't want to hear, or that some people don't want to hear.
Could I just say that as a member of this task group, even though I am a state employee, I would welcome seeing that some of that data, Cheryl, and I absolutely would read it, as I would like to assume everyone that receives it would do as well.
Okay, thank you, Marley.
I'd like to respond to what Cheryl said as well. So there's 3 areas of concern: human health, equity, and cost. And what we have not heard about is that it's expensive and that it's inefficient. And we know that from other articles we've read. The equity, in as far as McNeil is concerned, the social equity is inequities are appalling, because the top of the smokestack is in a valley. The building's in a valley. The top of the smokestack is almost equal to where the people live. And these are all the margins of town. These are low income people. And they impact the people of color, BIPOC. The other thing I would like to say is that there has been some discussions, but not the kinds of discussions that we want to see. We want to see all of these articles we're reading about the other perspective. We're not hearing from those people. You talked about, Billy, that the Department of Health gave a report that the visits to the hospitals for COPD and asthma has reduced. It has reduced, but so has the age. So the average visit for COPD in 2013 was 35 years old. Now it's a 20-year-old. The average person who had a hospital visit for asthma, it was 27. Now it's a 10-year-old kid from that neighborhood. That information was not presented. I personally went to the community health center and they directed me to CDC where I got that information. And so that's what we're talking about when a one-sided story is presented. We know the information is there. We want to hear it publicly on record, and we can't.
Thanks, Judy. I think, as we've discussed, we're extending the life of this task group. And my understanding is that Jane is working actively with everyone to schedule any presenter that is relevant to the group that folks want to come in. So I think we tried to start with the Vermont Health Department as an expert in this space. If their data was not sufficient, we're happy to hear from more people. I don't think anyone is suggesting there's not impacts associated with the burning of wood. So I think we want to get that information.
Well, let me read an email from Jane, or at least a sentence. In response to somebody she agreed to, that person was asked, and then she said, well, as I look at this closer, this seems relevant, but not directly within the scope, as it is about broader air quality issues, but not greenhouse gases specifically. So she hems and haws every time we suggest somebody with a different perspective. So you can go ahead and say that, Billy, but you're not asking for another perspective. I am. Cheryl is. Annette is. I got on this committee to learn.
Well, I'll let Jane speak for herself, but I don't think she's actively trying to prevent dialogue. And if there's people that you want to come to the subcommittee that aren't being invited, let me know and we can work through it.
Be happy to let you know.
Yeah,
Thank
great.
you.
Ryan, you've got your hand up.
Sure, thanks, Billy. I'm trying to touch on another part of the comments about gross versus net and process for the Global Warming Solutions Act. I'm not trying to cut off conversation on this biomass topic.
I think if you have a comment now, you should feel free to drop it, and we can come back to this.
Okay. I just wanted to share, a point of information about, the United States and the Biden administration rejoining the Paris Accord and the resubmitted U.S. nationally determined contribution. Right. That is, in the bold, high-level summary is the United States is setting an economy-wide target of reducing its net greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% below 2005 levels in 2030. And then when it speaks to agriculture and lands, it of course talks about the need to reduce emissions, but also enhance carbon sinks through a range of programs. When we look at the Global Warming Solutions Act and the path that bill took, H688, through the legislature, that bill was not referred to on either the House or Senate side of Committee on Agriculture or Forestry. And so that this kind of consideration in the IPCC of how the ag, forestry, and land use sector, which is inclusive of whether you want to use the term or not, natural and working lands, ag, forestry, wetlands, what have you, right? All of those lands that aren't developed, or anyways, those other sectors that are accounted for emissions inventory, I don't know, I just wanted to raise that point. It didn't go to a committee that might look at this question of climate change, emissions reductions, mitigation, and need for resilience in a way that's different compared to many of the fossil fuel-based sectors in my view. So I just wanted to throw that out there, and from the agencies of Ag's perspective, making sure that we look at the role agriculture can play in both reducing emissions from those operations, but also the role soil can play in sequestering carbon, and the need for farms to become more resilient in the face of climate change, and how resilience on farms can also benefit neighbors to those ag operations. So I appreciate those comments, and just raising a bit of disconnect in how the U.S. is approaching something versus the rural, rather agricultural state of Vermont is approaching. We have 50 million more pounds of live weight of cows in Vermont than we do humans. So we may not have more cows than humans, but we certainly have more poundage. Okay. Anyway, thanks.
Thanks, Ryan. And I just want to jump in. I think Jane has to leave at noon for an interview. So thanks, Jane, for your support today. And we can carry on for a little bit longer if folks want to. Cheryl.
I just have one quick thing to say from what Ryan said, is that soils are incredibly important, especially for carbon sequestration and storage, and especially in other ecosystems such as forests and wetlands, and incredibly important. And this is one of the reasons that we should look at that and protect wetlands of all sizes, not just that are big enough to fit on the radar. So that's another thing that this subcommittee should be paying attention to.
Thanks. And I just got to say, I'd like to say for the record that I would ask folks generally to be respectful of the state employees that are working hard to support the work of the task groups and the subcommittees, and that people are not working under some agenda to thwart conversation. People doing the best that they can to support these conversations, to engage with the task members, and to bring presenters forward. And if they're not doing it the way that you want, then share that feedback and we'll do our best to accommodate. But this notion that there's some kind of strategy to thwart conversation and exclude voices, I just don't think is true. It's not been my experience. It's not been my goal or desire as a co-chair of this subcommittee or in any of the work that we do here. So I'd ask folks to try to put that thinking aside. And if there's a need for more conversation, a need for more voices, to share that with me and with others, and we'll make sure it happens. But folks are doing the best they can in their jobs, and I think they're doing very good work. And I'd ask you to not be personal in your attacks and to just raise things that you need, and we'll do our best to make them happen.
I would like to say something about that, Billy. I
Sure.
agree, that's true, but it really has been very frustrating, and it's really obvious that some people are really have vested interests, and I don't know why, right? Well, sometimes I do know why. I know exactly why. With certain people, it has been brought to light, and that's sad. And I'm not naming names, but the other thing is, I've talked to a few different people that are in the departments, and they really kind of aren't allowed to talk about what they really want. I know this for a fact. They have to talk about, they have to, carry the message of the administration, actually, and some people, the people who are appointed by the governor, those people have even said that they have to do that. Some of them have kind of spoken their mind anyway, but many not. And I'm talking about other people not in this context, not in the context of this Vermont Climate Council and subcommittees, but in other contexts. That's it. And I apologize for saying, no, I don't apologize for what I put in the chat before. I got really frustrated, and it's really frustrating. And the government employees are paid for their time to do this, and people like Abby and Chris are not, and they have to take time away from what is putting food on the table in order to do this. And Judy, and given like a very small amount, I can't remember what it is. And people like me who don't even do anything but just are here caring, and I'm working because I care about it all. It's why I got the degrees that I did, and why I'm in the fields that I am, and why I'm not making much money. That's it.
Cheryl,
Judy.
Abby. No, Judy, go ahead.
Billy, exactly what you just said is what's been so upsetting. You didn't say that when Jane rolled her eyes about my comments and was extremely disrespectful. It's a two-way street. If you're going to ask us to show respect for employees, you have to show respect for us and our voices and our opinions and our considerations. It's a two-way street. What you just said was offensive.
Okay, thanks for that. Well, obviously, we all have a lot of work to do to be in a better place where we are clear what respect and our expectations of each other are. So thank you for sharing that. I'll certainly try to do better in my part. And I just ask us all to think about the best way we can work together going forward. And with that, any other comments folks would like to share with the group before we adjourn for the day? It's been great to see you all again. Okay, well, Abby and I will get some directions for next steps out, and we will try to get together again later in September. Okay, bye.